Well, the doesn't need much of an introduction. I looked some things up, and Randy came here the very first time on April 3rd, 2014. And this is his fifth time to come over. Well, fourth time to come over here. The other time he did a virtual for us when we were shut down. So, Randy, come on up, and thanks for coming back over from Tulsa.
Well, thanks for, keep asking me back or forgetting you invited me the first time. But, yeah, okay, well, that's fine. Some of you may know this is an audience participation deal. I'm just going to talk for a little bit, and then it's whatever you guys want to talk about, because I figure I just assume not bore people with things they already know or don't care about. So, but I will say a few things, because there is a little bit of news going on, even though we're in an off election year and the legislature isn't meeting yet. So, which is not going to be the case much longer. There's going to be a special session on August the 3rd. The governor has called that. And he wants to cut state income taxes, or state taxes. They've mainly talked about income tax, but they've also talked about some other things too. And my understanding is that that's probably not going to happen. One, because the Senate is not on board with it. The leadership in the Senate thinks that would be a foolhardy thing to do. They want to see the economy come back to a little bit more something like normal after the roller coaster we've been on, and also all the federal money that's been injected into the system works its way through. I would say there's some other considerations. One is what's going on in Washington, where they're talking about cutting federal spending by 8 to 10% or even more, which sounds pretty good if you're a fiscal conservative, but experience tells us if they were to do that, that doesn't mean that the demand for the services would stop. It would just mean that it's all going to come down on the state and the local government. So anyway, we're going to have this discussion about, should we go ahead and cut taxes because we've got some money in savings, or should we wait and see what happens 2 or 3 years from now? Or should we try and do something about the fact that people are driving from Tulsa to Sallisaw to get their driving tests, and some people are taking 2 years to get their kids' birth certificates? Or try and get full staffing in the corrections department? So those are all discussions that are going to be had and continue to be had, but I can tell you, everybody's getting geared up already for the 2026 governor's race, and we have a speaker that probably would like to be governor. We have some other people that would like to be governor or lieutenant governor or something else. So this is going to be pushed. I've been told, I don't know how organized it is, but if the legislature doesn't act, they're probably not going to act in the special session, but if they don't do something in the spring, somebody's going to try and push a ballot measure to cut taxes. And ballot measures are always a risky thing, right? I mean, I would say by and large, initiative petitions don't create the best policy, but if they're successful, they're an indication the legislature is not listening to the voters. So, we got things like legalized medical marijuana because the legislature wouldn't deal with it. And a lot of people don't like the law that got passed. It had a lot of problems with it. But people kept telling, the legislature, you've got to do something. You've got to do something. And they never could agree on it. So the people did it. Anyway. In Washington, we have, we're probably a week or so away from what they call a shutdown. It's not really a complete shutdown because there are large segments of the government that continue to function even after the funding authorization expires. But it'll be a pain in the neck if you have to, do something with your Social Security or your Medicare, or you need a passport, which is already, I understand, a problem. So there's just a lot of things. going on, and that kind of brings me to my next point or bigger point is that, I every day I tell myself 2 or 3 times, nobody cares what you think, because I feel like, as a reporter, that's, I should keep that in mind. Nobody cares what I think. But I can't help it. I do have some thoughts every once in a while. And I try and, think of them as questions or theories, because I've also concluded that the more I learn in life, the less I know. You learn things, and then suddenly you're not as sure as you used to be about certain things. But one of the things that seems to me is that we live in a really difficult time for a lot of reasons. And one of those reasons is that we have more people than we're used to in leadership positions who try to get their way just by yelling the loudest and saying, I don't care what the facts are or the data says. We're going to do it this way. I don't care what the law is. We're going to do it this way. And I think, the result of that is that we create a system that's so unpleasant that people walk away from it. We're in a period where fewer and fewer people pay attention to the news because it's so unpleasant. They don't want to participate in politics because it's so unpleasant. If you go, like Representative Ranson, you go up there or go down to Oklahoma City 3 or 4 months a year, and it's just a constant people insulting you. Now, it's one thing to disagree. That's a good thing. But, it's reached a level where people just don't want to participate. And I think we're really seeing that. I don't know what the situation in Payne County is, but we're having a really hard time getting people to work the polls. In 2024, we're going to have a hard time putting on elections because there's not enough people. The election board secretary in Tulsa County is practically panic-stricken because nobody wants to work the polls. Again, you make the system unpleasant enough and difficult enough that people just aren't going to show up. And so, I think there's a lot of other things. Energy. How do we create enough energy to keep the world as we know it moving? We don't have people starving to death and freezing to death and all of that stuff without boiling ourselves to death. It's a real problem. I mean, it's something that you can't, on the one hand, we have people who march and just want to cut off fossil fuels. And on the other hand, we have people who think it's not a problem. Well, somewhere you got to figure out, people in the middle are afraid to speak up. They're afraid to say anything because they're going to get yelled at from both sides. I know, because I get yelled at all the time. So that's one thing. I don't want to take too much here. I actually, I guess, had more here. But I will say this. So just to give you an example, the budget, so the federal budget, it's a real problem. There's, what are we? We've crossed $35 trillion or something in debt. And that's a significant amount of money. And the 1st District Congressman, Kevin Hearn, he's a big budget hawk, he wants. So, and I was at a Republican deal that he was speaking at, and he just flat out told people, to fix this, we're all going to have to accept a lower standard of living. And that was he's just talking about the budget. He's not even addressing the energy issues. He's not talking about inflation. He's not talking about anything else. He's just talking about budget issues. He's telling his own supporters, you guys are going to have to accept, and I will too, a lower standard of living. Of course, Kevin Hearn's worth about $25 million, so it's probably a little easier for him to absorb than some I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe you guys are. All right. So that's been my little rant, I guess. And I think I'll just stop and see who wants to ask questions, what's on your mind or whatever. Yep.
Yeah, Randy, could you give us your take on the Ryan Walters versus Tulsa Public Schools, and just sort of your analysis of what's going on there?
Well, so I have not been terribly involved in covering Ryan Walters, but I've been watching it, and I know something about it, and this is one of the things we're going to have to decide. I mean, one of the things we have to decide as a society is, what do we really mean by a democracy or a representative democracy? Do we want, everybody to kind of have a generally equal say, or do we want something else? And that is showing up in the education system. We have people who have, for a long time, not believed in public education. And now they are taking control of the public education system. I mean, whether you like him or don't like him, I think everybody would have to agree that the current superintendent of public instruction in Oklahoma doesn't believe in public instruction. He believes and the governor is in the same way. He's been very open about it. For years and years and years, we talked about consolidating schools and having more efficiency in schools. They're talking about creating more schools and spreading the money around. And so, I guess I tend to be a little cynical about some of these things, but the biggest thing that state and local government does in Oklahoma, dollar-wise, is education. We're talking about $5 or $6 billion out there. And there are a lot of people figuring how they could get just a little tiny piece of that. Because a little tiny piece of it is a few $1 million. And, a lot of this is not about, private schools versus public schools, because they all serve a purpose. Or at least if they don't serve a purpose, they shouldn't exist. And the way I think about it is, it's not about, say, Bishop McGinnis High School in Oklahoma City or Bishop Kelly in Tulsa. Those schools have been around a long time, and we pretty much know what they do. But if you put $5 or $6 billion out there and say, have at it, and by the way, we don't believe in any oversight, which is what they've said. What's to prevent me from saying, hey, I'm going to start a school, and so I want my little piece of that, all those billions of dollars. I don't know if that answers your question, but it really is true. There's a large number of people in public life who are devoted to destroying the public school system. And so this is one of my ideas, and I don't say that it's just an idea, but it seems to me like maybe all of this started 70 years ago with Brown versus Board of Education. And I don't mean so much in the sense of desegregation, race. There may be some of that still around, but I think that's when people began to feel like they no longer controlled their local schools. That may have been one of the first times the federal government, in the form of the courts, and later the President of the United States, Eisenhower, intervening and saying, you have to do it this way. We don't care if you've done it the other way for 100 years. This is the way you have to do it. And that's when you started seeing people leave public schools. So this is a long-running thing. And it's another reason why I say we're in a difficult time.
I've got a question over here. My name's Abby, and I resonate with a lot of what you said. I read the news. I can't stand to watch the news because I have enough stress in other areas, and that just adds to it. So I read the news, but I'm curious in your thoughts of, for those that are either just right or just left of center, that don't identify with extreme either way. We're seeing that more people are flocking to the independent party. What are some of the long-term implications of that? Because, I mean, that can obviously take votes from both parties, and I'm just curious your thoughts on that trend and if that is an actual trend that's happening.
Yeah, it is a trend. I mean, nationally, there are, I think it's 9 states. So there are some states that don't register by party. And there's one state, North Dakota, that does not register voters at all. So there's like, I think it's 34 or 35 states that register voters by party. And in 9 of those, the largest voting bloc now is independent. And I'm not talking about an independent party. I mean, they have no party affiliation. And in some other states, they're number 2. In Oklahoma, the independent group, percentage-wise, is the fastest growing group. And traditionally, people who registered as independent didn't vote. But in recent years, that seems to not be so much the case. And so I think, we could see there is a push nationally to go more to open primaries. And there's different ways of doing open primaries. I think it's possible you could see an initiative petition in Oklahoma to go that way. Now, how it would turn out, I don't know. I think it'd be a really tough sell. I mean, you have to keep in mind, this is true I don't tend to think of things as Republican or Democrat. I think of as majority and minority, because that's the human tendency. When you're in the majority, you act one way. When you're in the minority, you act another way. So if you're in the majority and things are pretty much going your way, you don't want to change anything, and so it's really hard to make those changes. I don't know where we're going with that. I mean, we've been on this track for a long time of sort of the fringes controlling, and we see this in Congress now, with the budget deal. There's like 12 people in the House of Representatives that are controlling the budget process. And they're on what some people would consider the far right. I mean, they're making the most radical demands, I guess you could call it that, or extreme. And because of the, majority-minority situation, and because we've come to a point where no one wants to vote across the aisle, at least in Congress. It happens in the legislature. It sometimes, and if you have nonpartisan local elections, I found this really interesting in Tulsa because I went there when it was a partisan elections, and now it's nonpartisan, and I think it's really changed the dynamic of city, of the way the city's run. But to get back to your point, the only thing I can say is that if we don't change, if we don't go to some kind of an open primary that brings the independents, because right now if you're registered as an independent, I'm registered as an independent. I can vote in the Democratic primary. Okay, that means I get to pick whoever it is loses to the Republican in the general election. But if you go to some kind of deal where the independents have more say, that might influence things. But if those people in the middle, and of course if you're in the middle, you hardly ever hear of a radical moderate, right? I mean, so, but if those people get upset enough and say, we're tired of all this, then here's what I would predict will happen. They're going to start registering as Republicans. And they're going to start voting in Republican primaries. And they're going to start voting for the most moderate Republican. Because right now, we had a guy a legislator into the Tulsa World a week or two ago, and basically he was begging us to save him from the extremes in his own party. He wasn't worried about the Democrats. He was worried about the guys in his own party. So that's that, but people take their voter registration really seriously, and I understand that. And some people just, I don't really want to do this because I don't really. But the way our system is, And I'm not telling people to go out and register as a Republican, but I'm saying if you don't like the way things are working, you got to figure out a way for your vote to count the most. And maybe if people start doing that, the majority will say, well, maybe we should go to. And look, there are problems with open primaries. But our founders, our country was based on the idea that we would not have political parties. And that, of course, they formed almost immediately. And maybe everybody knew they would, but a lot of the leaders of the founders, they thought political parties were bad. And I can tell you from experience, and somebody who deals with people all over the political spectrum, the good guys are not all on one team. You know, when I was growing up, and I was a big sports fan, I thought all the good guys were on the OSU football team. And then I got to know some of them, and I got to know some of those guys down the road at Norman, and you know what? There were good guys on both teams. So anyway, that's another long answer that may not even be an answer.
Hi. You mentioned Congress is kind of trending towards spending less money over a time period. Do you see a scenario in which the state funds that were allocated federally to expand Medicare and State Question 802 get cut and the legislators stuck holding that bill?
Well, anything's possible. I don't think that's being discussed right now, but I mean, in the near term, that would never get through the Senate. I'm not sure to even get through the House, and the current president would certainly not sign that. Now, what happens after 2024, after next year, or in 2025? Almost anything's possible. But I would say this, so another problem with initiative petitions in Oklahoma is that we stick way too much stuff in a constitution that already has way too much stuff in it. And so it's hard to change. But if it looks like it's going to be a really, a tough thing for Oklahoma, I would expect, there to be some action to repeal or modify that expanded. And I would have to, I'm not sure of the language. So if the federal program changes, I'm not sure if the state program changes too. I don't know. So, like, there are people who would like to, take us down to the military and the border patrol, and that's pretty much it. Because I say that's pretty much everything that's in the Constitution. And then there's people who would like the federal government to do everything. Sorry, I don't know. I think it's possible, but I don't think it's being talked about much at this point.
Could you talk just a little bit more about the landscape for the governor's race in 2026?
Well, so it's 3 years away, and you would think that it would not be that intense, but of course it's going to be an open seat, and we've had people lining up. At this point, everybody seems to think Charles McCall is going to run. A lot of people think Matt Pinnell is going to run. There's a high probability that Gentner Drummond, the Attorney General, is going to run. He hadn't made much secret of that. So that's 3, and 2 of them have a lot of money. I mean, of their own money, which is another factor, And, I don't know, as the Democrats, I don't know. In the last couple of times around, they've almost had to, beg somebody, and that's understandable because it is such an uphill, the sort of the generic Republican versus generic Democrat. If you just look at the returns from last year, it's like if a Democrat breaks 40% in a statewide election, that's pretty good. And a Republican who nobody likes or has heard of is almost guaranteed to get 60%. So, so those are the three main ones. I think there's some thought that Greg Treat might, but now that I've been told, I don't know, that that's not as likely. And, you don't know. There may be another Kevin Stitt out there, somebody with money who just believes that they have the answers and they want to be governor. I know I haven't heard that he's a candidate, but one name that does come up some, and I can't think of his name, Chad, the guy at Paycom, the guy who owns Paycom, the big Oklahoma City company. Apparently he was kind of one of the forces behind the anti-Stitt campaign last time around. Chad Richardson. So, now, what are they going to run on? Well, Gintner will run as a kind of he'll run as a conservative, but he's really more pretty moderate. I mean, he's really pretty much follow the law kind of a guy. McCall has been. Trish would know a lot more about McCall than I do, but he's been very effective in holding a large majority together, and that's a hard thing to do because those big majorities tend to come flying apart under pressure. So, and then Matt Pinnell, the lieutenant governor, he's got a lot of connections. He's a likable guy. He might get sucked into the Swadley's scandal. And, you don't know, Ryan Walters may decide he wants to be governor. I'm pretty sure that he sees some future out there as something, but I don't know if it's in government or not. He may be going for the money. I don't know.
I was interested to know your opinion of, it seems like that Oklahoma's unsettled about, and now some of the tribes are asking for help with the decision made by the McGirt decision.
Yeah.
What's going to happen with that, and how do we help Oklahoma and the tribes as well with what's been decided? Can it be undone, or will it be undone? What do you think about that?
Well, so what I think is that all of that can be resolved if all the parties want it to be. And I think, now this is just me, my perception is most of the tribes would rather not be spending a lot of money on law enforcement and judicial systems. They would rather do the fun stuff, build houses and pass out scholarship checks and do the health care. I mean, the casinos pay for themselves and then all this other stuff that they do. And so and another thing I would kind of throw out there, I don't have any kind of empirical evidence for this, but so I think the tribes are perceived by the governor and some other people as really being the only political threat to them. And it's not so much as a voting bloc, because as we saw in the last election, they're not a voting bloc, but they do things that some people don't like. Like they spend a lot of money on health care, they spend a lot of money on housing. They get into the communities, and the people in the communities like them. At least in eastern Oklahoma. I mean, I kind of have. So I grew up in western Oklahoma, but I've lived most of my life in eastern Oklahoma, and I've seen, there's a big difference in the two. Can it be fixed? Yes. Will it be fixed? I don't know. I mean, something will have to be done, and but it's going to take a willingness to work it out, and I think what's happened now is, if you think back, even before McGirt, the governor had pretty much thrown the gauntlet down and said, I'm the boss, you're not, We're going to do things my way. And so then McGirt came along, and a lot of the almost all of the tribes now have got their backs up so much that it's hard, they don't want to back down. He won't back down. So we're in this, in sort of a limbo. I don't think it's the lawless, we don't feel, the people who live in Tulsa don't feel like they're living in a state of law, or at least any more lawlessness than they ever did. But there are, these holes that things fall in, and we had the situation, the speeding ticket. Okay, how do you do that? It seems to me like there's a pretty easy solution to that. You give all the law officers a standard speeding ticket form, you check the right box as far as the jurisdiction, and you give it to them. And they can either pay it or they can go to the tribal court. It's the same thing as if you get a speeding ticket on the highway going to Dallas out of Tulsa. Well, you guys probably don't go that way, but if you go to Dallas from Tulsa, you go down to McAllister and angle across, and you may look up and there's a rotating light in your rear window. It's a local police officer. There's no town in sight, but there was like half a mile in there where the speed limit dropped, and you didn't know it. So my point is that the same thing happens now. You can get stopped for speeding in any small town, and your choice is, I pay the ticket, or I go back to the small town and I fight it, and then I pay the ticket because they're not gonna give me. And so I think we've had a lot of, but there's been a lot of confusion. It's put a lot of pressure on the federal courts in Muskogee and in Tulsa, which have been complicated by the fact we can't get any judges appointed because we have a Democratic administration and a Republican congressional delegation, and they can't agree on who the judges are going to be. It's kind of playground stuff. They got to learn how to work together. And I don't think Congress is going to act, because Congress is not going to act unless the Oklahoma delegation wants them to act. And the Oklahoma delegation, especially with Tom Cole as part of it, is not going to do anything until the tribes are okay with it.
Thank you, Randy.